When people look at the Empire State Building today, they see pride, power, and progress. They see a shining symbol of America touching the sky. But few ever stop to wonder what it cost to build that dream. Behind the steel, the limestone, and the lights lies a story carved from fear, hunger, and human lives. The Empire State Building rose during one of the darkest periods in American history, the Great Depression. Jobs were rare, money was scarce, and survival itself had become a daily struggle. For thousands of men, this building was not a monument, it was a gamble. Refuse the job, and your family might starve. Accept it, and you risk never coming home. Construction moved at a brutal speed. Floors were completed in days, not weeks. Workers balanced on narrow steel beams, hundreds of feet above the ground, with no safety harnesses, no helmets, and no second chances. A single slip meant death. The wind at that height was unforgiving, and the cold cut through skin and bone. Yet the work never stopped. Many of the laborers were immigrants, Irish, Italian, Mohawk ironworkers. Men whose names history barely remembers. They were paid little, worked long hours, and were expected to stay silent. When accidents happened, the city did not pause. Another worker stepped forward, and construction continued as if nothing had occurred. Official records claimed only a few deaths, but witnesses told a different story. Falls, crushed bodies, sudden disappearances. These moments were quietly buried to protect the building's image. There were no grand memorials, no public mourning. Just families left with questions and no answers. Even after completion, the darkness did not fade. The building opened in 1931, but the economy was still collapsing. Offices stood empty. People mocked it, calling it the empty state building. Financial failure haunted its early years, and despair clung to its halls. Then came the tragedies no one likes to mention. In its early decades, the building became a site of multiple suicides. People climbed to its heights seeking escape from debt, shame, and hopelessness. The structure meant to symbolize hope became, for some, a final destination. Nets were eventually installed, not to honor the suffering, but to hide it. Today, millions visit the Empire State Building, take photos, and admire the view. Few realize they are standing on the echoes of silent sacrifices. The building does not speak, but its walls remember. Every beam holds a story of fear. Every floor carries the weight of human endurance. This is not just a skyscraper. It is a reminder that greatness is sometimes built on unseen pain, and that history often celebrates the achievement while forgetting the cost. The Empire State Building was constructed during the Great Depression, a time when desperation did not simply influence decisions, it controlled them. By the late 1920s and early 1930s, America was collapsing under the weight of economic failure. Banks were shutting their doors overnight, factories stood silent, and unemployment spread like a slow, moving disaster. Millions of people were suddenly stripped of security, dignity, and choice. In this atmosphere, survival became more important than safety. An opportunity, no matter how dangerous, was something few could afford to refuse. For powerful businessmen and city leaders, the decision to build the Empire State Building was driven by fear as much as ambition. New York was locked in a silent competition to prove dominance, to show the world that America was not broken, even as bread lines stretched through its streets. Constructing the tallest building on Earth was a statement of defiance against economic collapse. It did not matter that the timing was reckless or that demand for office space barely existed. What mattered was speed, symbolism, and pride. For workers, the desperation was far more personal. Men lined up daily at construction sites, hoping their name would be called. Many had already lost everything: homes, savings, futures. Immigrants especially carried the weight of families who depended on every dollar sent home. When offered a job on the Empire State Building, few asked about safety. Asking questions meant risking replacement. There were always dozens of men waiting behind you, equally hungry, equally desperate. Wages were low, but they were wages, and in the Great Depression, that alone was enough to silence fear. The building rose at an astonishing pace, because time itself had become an enemy. The faster it was completed, the cheaper it would be, and the sooner investors could hope for profit. This urgency filtered down to the workers, who were pushed to meet impossible deadlines. Breaks were short. Complaints were ignored. Injuries were treated as inconveniences rather than warnings. Desperation also shaped how loss was handled. When accidents happened, and they happened often, there was no room for mourning. A fallen worker was quickly replaced. The machinery kept moving. The city kept watching the skyline grow taller, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge what was being lost in the process. In a nation drowning in despair, individual lives became statistics, and sometimes not even that. The Empire State Building did not rise from confidence or prosperity. It rose from fear, fear of failure, fear of irrelevance, fear of starvation. Every steel beam was lifted in an era where people believed that stopping was more dangerous than falling. And so, against a backdrop of economic ruin, the building climbed skyward, shaped not just by engineering and ambition, but by a nation's quiet willingness to sacrifice human safety in exchange for hope. Workers faced extreme danger, long hours, and minimal safety protection. But during the era of the Empire State Building's construction, these conditions were not seen as unacceptable. They were seen as normal. The early 1930s offered almost no labor protections, and construction safety laws were weak, poorly enforced, or ignored entirely. A man stepping onto the steel framework of the rising tower accepted a silent agreement. The job paid wages, not guarantees of survival. Each day, workers climbed higher into the sky, walking across thin steel beams, hundreds of feet above the streets of New York. There were no harnesses to stop a fall, no helmets to protect against falling tools, and no safety nets stretched below them. Wind gusts could strike without warning, shaking the beams beneath their boots. In winter, steel turned icy, burning the skin through thin gloves. In summer, heat reflected off the metal, exhausting bodies already pushed beyond their limits. Hours were long and relentless. Shifts often stretched from early morning until fading daylight, and sometimes longer if deadlines demanded it. Fatigue became constant, dulling reflexes and slowing judgment. A moment of weakness. One misstep, one slip of a hand, could mean instant death. Yet stopping to rest was a luxury few could afford. Supervisors watched closely, and any worker who slowed down risked being labeled unreliable and replaced. The danger did not come only from heights. Heavy materials swung through the air on cranes, often inches from workers' heads. Riveters worked in teams, where one man heated metal bolts until they glowed red. Another caught them mid-air, and a third hammered them into place. A single miscalculation could lead to severe burns, crushed fingers, or worse. Noise from machinery was constant, overwhelming, and disorienting, making communication difficult and mistakes more likely. Injuries were common, and medical response was minimal. A man who was hurt badly enough to stop working often disappeared from the job site entirely, replaced by someone just as desperate. There was little compensation, no counseling, and no recognition of the trauma workers carried home, if they made it home at all. Families waited each evening, never certain if the man who left in the morning would return. Despite the risks, the building rose at record speed because fear was outweighed by necessity. Workers accepted danger not because they were brave, but because they had no alternative. The Empire State Building stands today as a triumph of engineering, but within its walls remains the memory of men who worked endless hours in deadly conditions, protected by nothing more than balance, experience, and hope that luck would be on their side one more day. Several laborers lost their lives, but their stories were rarely documented, and this silence was not accidental. It was part of the system that allowed the Empire State Building to rise so quickly. During the early 1930s, worker deaths were an uncomfortable truth that companies preferred to minimize or erase. Publicly acknowledging the full human cost of construction risked damaging the image of progress and strength that the building was meant to represent. Official records listed only a small number of fatalities, carefully counted and cautiously reported. But these numbers failed to capture the full reality on the ground. Accidents were frequent: men falling from great heights, being struck by falling tools, crushed by shifting steel, or caught in machinery. Some deaths occurred instantly, others days later in hospitals, quietly removed from the construction narrative. Once a worker left the site injured, he often vanished from the story entirely. Most of the men who died were immigrants or laborers without social power: Irish, Italian, and native Mohawk ironworkers, whose lives were considered replaceable. Their families were rarely informed in detail. There were no official ceremonies, no plaques, and no public recognition of sacrifice. At best, a paycheck might arrive weeks later. At worst, families received nothing but silence. Newspapers of the time were more interested in reporting how fast the building was rising than who was being lost in the process. Headlines celebrated engineering milestones while ignoring the human toll beneath them. Deaths were treated as unfortunate, but acceptable risks, background noise in the story of national pride. Even coworkers were discouraged from speaking openly about accidents, fearing job loss or retaliation. On the construction site, there was little time to grieve. When a man fell, work paused briefly, sometimes only long enough to clear the area. Then the steel beams rose again, and another worker took the empty place. Survival required emotional numbness. Acknowledging loss meant acknowledging fear, and fear was dangerous in a job where confidence was everything. As years passed, names were forgotten, records faded, and the dead became statistics or were erased completely. The Empire State Building became a global symbol of success, but it was built in part by men whose stories were never told, whose lives ended in silence, and whose contributions were absorbed into the structure without acknowledgement. The building stands tall today, not only as a monument to ambition, but also as a reminder of how easily human lives can disappear when progress becomes more important than memory. The building was rushed to completion at an inhuman pace, driven by a sense of urgency that bordered on obsession. From the very beginning, speed was treated as the highest priority, even more important than safety or sustainability. The goal was not simply to build tall, but to build faster than anyone thought possible. In the middle of economic collapse, delay meant financial ruin, and every extra day of construction was seen as a threat to investors and reputation. Work on the Empire State Building moved with astonishing speed. Entire floors were completed in just a few days. Schedules were ruthless and unforgiving. Crews worked simultaneously on different levels, steel rising above while stonework and interiors followed closely behind. There was no pause to reflect, no time to reassess conditions. The building grew upward, like a living thing that demanded constant feeding with labor and exhaustion. This pace pushed workers beyond human limits. Rest became rare. Fatigue was constant. Men climbed hundreds of feet day after day, repeating the same dangerous motions until their bodies learned to ignore pain and fear. Mistakes increased as exhaustion set in, but slowing down was not an option. Supervisors measured success by progress, not by well-being. Falling behind meant pressure, warnings, or replacement. The rush also meant cutting corners wherever possible. Safety checks were minimal. Equipment was used until it failed. Weather conditions that should have halted work, strong winds, rain, freezing temperatures, were often ignored. The building schedule did not bend for nature or human weakness. Steel was lifted even when visibility was poor, and workers were expected to maintain balance and precision in conditions that made survival uncertain. This relentless speed created an atmosphere where human life felt secondary. When accidents occurred, they were absorbed into the momentum of construction. There was no room for investigation or delay. Another worker stepped in, and the timeline remained unchanged. Progress continued upward, fueled by the unspoken understanding that the building mattered more than the men building it. The result was a structure completed in just over a year, an achievement still admired today. But that achievement came at a cost measured, not only in exhaustion and injury, but in fear, silence, and loss. The Empire State Building rose rapidly, because it was built in an era where slowing down felt more dangerous than pushing people beyond their limits, and where speed itself became a form of sacrifice. Immigrant workers risk everything for survival and small wages, because for many of them, there was no other choice. They arrived in America carrying hope, but by the time the Great Depression took hold, that hope had been stripped down to a single goal: survival. Jobs were scarce, discrimination was common, and immigrant communities were often the first to suffer when the economy collapsed. When work on the Empire State Building became available, it represented danger, but it also represented food on the table. Many of these workers came from Irish, Italian, Eastern European, and indigenous Mohawk communities. They were accustomed to hard labor, but the risks they faced on this construction site went far beyond hardship. Language barriers made safety instructions difficult to understand, and cultural isolation kept many workers silent. Complaining or refusing unsafe tasks was unthinkable. One protest could end a job permanently, and there were countless others waiting to take that place. The wages were modest, especially considering the danger involved. But during the Depression, even small wages carried enormous weight. A few dollars could mean rent paid, children fed, or relatives supported back home. For immigrant workers, failure was not personal, it was collective. Families and entire communities depended on each man who climbed those steel beams each morning. Many lived with constant fear, not just of falling, but of being replaced. Injury often meant unemployment, and unemployment meant hunger. There was no safety net, no compensation to rely on, no legal protection strong enough to matter. As a result, workers pushed through pain, hid injuries, and returned to work before they were fully healed, knowing that weakness could cost them everything. For Mohawk ironworkers in particular, the work was both a legacy and a burden. Their skill at working high, above the ground, made them highly sought after, but it also placed them in the most dangerous positions. Their bravery was admired, yet their sacrifices were rarely acknowledged beyond the job site. Risk became part of their identity, even when it shortened lives. Every day, these immigrant workers stood at the edge of disaster for wages that barely reflected the danger they faced. They built one of the world's most famous structures, not because it was safe or glamorous, but because hunger and responsibility left them no alternative. The Empire State Building stands today as a symbol of achievement. But beneath that achievement lies the quiet truth that many who built it risked everything and received very little in return. The early years of the Empire State Building were financially bleak, earning it a grim nickname that quietly reflected failure rather than triumph. When the building opened in 1931, it was meant to symbolize confidence and recovery, but instead it entered a city still drowning in economic collapse. Businesses were shutting down, companies were shrinking, and few could afford to rent office space, especially in a massive, expensive skyscraper built during the worst financial crisis in American history. Floors upon floors sat empty. Elevators rose through silence instead of activity. The grand vision of a bustling vertical city never materialized in those early years. Tenants were scarce, and rent prices had to be slashed just to attract interest. Even then, many offices remained dark, unused, and echoing. The building, that was supposed to generate wealth, instead drained it, becoming a heavy financial burden rather than a profitable investment. The public noticed, quietly at first, then openly. People began calling it the Empty State Building. The nickname spread because it felt accurate. From the outside, the skyscraper looked powerful and complete, but inside it felt hollow, an enormous structure without purpose. It stood tall over New York like a reminder of ambition that had ignored reality. Investors grew anxious. The cost of construction had been enormous, and the returns were disappointing. For years, the building failed to turn a profit. Maintenance costs, staffing, and operations continued while income lagged behind expectations. The very speed and scale that had once been celebrated now worked against it. It was simply too big for a city that could barely support itself. This financial failure added a quiet layer of darkness to the building's history. It was not only built through desperation, it existed within it. Workers had risked their lives to raise a structure that, for a long time, had no clear future. The building's empty offices reflected the emptiness felt by a nation struggling to recover. Eventually, the economy improved, and the Empire State Building found success and fame. But those early years left a permanent mark on its legacy. Beneath its reputation as a symbol of strength lies the memory of a time when it stood largely unused, mocked by its nickname. and haunted by the reality that even the tallest dreams can feel hollow when built in the wrong moment of history. Suicides and tragic accidents added to its dark reputation, turning the Empire State Building from a symbol of ambition into a silent witness of human despair. As the Great Depression deepened, hopelessness settled heavily over the city, and the building's great height began to attract people who felt they had nowhere else to turn. For some, the tower was no longer a place of progress. It became a final escape. In the years following its opening, a disturbing pattern emerged. Individuals burdened by debt, unemployment, and shame climbed to its upper levels, seeking release from lives they believed were already lost. Some stepped from observation areas. Others found hidden ledges or windows. These acts were shocking, but in a time of widespread suffering, they were also tragically common. Newspapers reported the incidents briefly, often without names, reducing deeply personal tragedies to short columns of text. The building's management struggled to respond. Early measures were reactive rather than compassionate. Guards were posted, barriers adjusted, and eventually safety fencing and nets were installed, not to address the despair driving people upward, but to stop the damage to the building's public image. The solution focused on concealment rather than understanding, reinforcing the idea that suffering was something to be hidden, not confronted. Accidents also continued long after construction ended. Maintenance workers, window washers, and technicians faced risks similar to those endured by the original builders. Falls, mechanical failures, and sudden medical emergencies occurred at dizzying heights where help could not arrive in time. Each incident added another layer to the building's reputation, a place where danger lingered, even in peacetime and prosperity. Word spread quietly through the city. The Empire State Building was admired, but it was also feared. People spoke about it in lowered voices, sharing stories of jumps, falls, and bodies on the pavement below. Over time, these stories blended with myth and rumor, deepening the building's dark aura. Whether exaggerated or real, they reflected a collective unease, tied to the suffering the structure seemed to attract. Today, visitors see bright lights, long lines, and breathtaking views. What they do not see is the emotional weight the building once carried, when it stood as a magnet for despair as much as for wonder. The dark reputation was not born from superstition, but from repeated human tragedy, proof that even the most iconic landmarks can become silent witnesses to pain when hope disappears. Behind its glamour lies a history of sacrifice, fear, and silence, a reality carefully buried beneath lights, postcards, and celebration. The Empire State Building is often presented as a triumph, a clean story of ambition and success. But that version exists only because so much was left untold. The suffering that made its existence possible was never meant to be remembered. It was absorbed into the structure, locked inside steel and stone, and quietly ignored as the city moved on. The sacrifice began long before the first visitor admired the view. Men gave their bodies to the job, enduring exhaustion, injury, and constant danger, not because they believed in the dream, but because hunger left them no alternative. Some never returned home. Others returned changed, carrying trauma they had no language to describe. Their sacrifices were not honored publicly, and their names were not preserved. Once the building stood complete, their role in its creation faded into anonymity. Fear was a daily companion during construction and long after. Workers lived with the knowledge that one mistake could end everything. Later, visitors and employees sensed a different kind of fear, the uneasy awareness of the tragedies associated with the building. Suicides, fatal accidents, and whispered stories gave the structure an emotional weight that contrasted sharply with its glamorous image. Yet these fears were rarely acknowledged openly, as if speaking them aloud might crack the illusion. Silence was the final layer that sealed this history away. Companies avoided detailed records. Newspapers minimized uncomfortable facts. The city chose celebration over reflection. Silence protected reputations, investments, and national pride, but it also erased human experience. Families mourned privately. Survivors carried memories alone. The building rose into legend, while the truth remained grounded in shadows. Today, the Empire State Building shines as a symbol of achievement. But its brilliance depends on forgetting what lies beneath. The glamour works because the silence endured. And within that silence remains the echo of lives risked, fears endured, and sacrifices never fully acknowledged, still present, even if no one speaks their names. So when you look up at the Empire State Building tonight, when you see it glowing against the sky, remember that it is more than steel and stone. Empire State Building is not just a symbol of height, power, or success. It is a silent witness. A witness to men who stood on beams with fear in their hearts, to families who waited and never saw someone return, to suffering that was hidden so progress could shine. The building still stands tall, but beneath its lights lives a truth we rarely acknowledge. Greatness often demands a price, and sometimes that price is paid by voices history chose not to remember.